My name's Oliver Sells. I am the chairman of the West Ham Park Committee, but that's not the reason I'm here today. I'm here today in a different capacity, which is chairman of Streets and Walkways, which looks after what it says on the tin. But don't worry. I want to start. I'm not going to go into the kind of detail that you've heard a lot of all from Will. I want to start with a confession and a conundrum. The confession is that I am, and always have been, passionate walker. I was brought up to walk in Scotland, in the lakes, Santiago de Compostela, anywhere and everywhere. And nothing has changed since I came to work in London. I remember when I first came that I was appalled at the way that London was both structured and run and organised for walkers. And it's taken me only 35 years of working in London to end up in charge of the city's streets. But it's a good thing that I got there in the end. The conundrum is quite different, really. It's a question. You've been asked several questions, but this is a question I want you to think about while I speak to you. What do the following people have in common? St. Paul, Hannibal, and Charles Dickens. I'll come back to it later. But there is a serious point. Walking is at the heart of the City of London's transport strategy. We have produced a document which I hope many of you have read. It's online and in hard copy. We started it a year or two ago. It was adopted by the City Corporation in May of this year. It has a raft of proposals, and I and my committee are now implementing those proposals. And we have made, I hope, considerable progress. I've worked out that there are about 200 proposals in all that we have to achieve, and I've set a target of 3 years, and we've done 46 or thereabout this year. One of the things I wanted to say was this. You've touched on capacity. I only want to make a few points, but I want to focus on them. Capacity is really one of the driving forces for the change that is taking place. It is a simple fact. In the City of London, we have about 8,000 residents, 500,000 workers come into the city in various ways every day. 90% of those journeys that are in the City of London are walked. Walking to and from public transport is part of it. Those numbers are increasing. Crossrail will bring a very large number of extra people into the centre of London. We estimate that over 100,000 people per day extra will be in the City of London within the next decade or so. And what the results you can see around all day, our pavements are overcrowded, uncomfortable. It makes for disagreeable and unpleasant walking. And the second point that I want to make is this. We need to radically rethink how our streets are designed and described. It's not coincidence that I also chair the City Open Spaces Committee. We have a large number of open spaces. And the view that I have taken since I started this earlier this year is that there is no real distinction to be made between them. Those days are over. Nothing less but our own form of London cultural revolution will do. It's a change of mindset. It's the requirement for political will to recognise that our streets are for people. They are not for vehicles first. They are open spaces. They are public realm. They are not rat runs. Our avenues, our byways, are for people to walk and live each and every day. And that includes families, children, the less abled, those with disabilities of sight. And we recognise that all these people come before motorised transport. And that will be our driving force, that people on foot come first. Of course, that has enormous consequences. I'm not going to touch on the very important point that Will Norman addressed earlier about health. It is, however, in my view, much underestimated. You only have to look, and he mentioned children of school age. We have got, in the last 40 years, into an appalling mindset of driving short distances with our children to school, dropping them off in crowded, dangerous gateways. We need to stop that and reverse it all over London, in my view. We know what people want. That's the third point I want to make. We know that there is a forceful public opinion now which supports bold decision-making. People want high-quality streets, good public spaces. There's no opposition from business, let me tell you. I talk to businesses the whole time in the City of London. And whereas you might have expected years ago people to complain, and they did, that how are they going to get there in their chauffeur-driven Daimlers and the like, those days are gone too. If you talk to Bloomberg or Nomura or any of the big city companies, they are pressing us to make the streets more agreeable for their employees, day in and day out. They want cultural diversity. We have a growing nighttime economy in the City of London, and indeed other boroughs have it too. There is a change, a shift taking place. And the simple truth is that in a city like ours, which has a fantastic network of public transport, there is simply no excuse for allowing people to drive their cars as though the world had not changed since 1965. It's over. Our proposals are no one has ever applauded anything I've ever said before on this. Our proposals in the city are quite radical. I urge you all to read them, and if they suit your area, follow them. We need to make walking quicker for people. Crossings are too slow. Waiting times are too long. We're going to stop that. We're going to widen pavements. We are closing streets on a regular basis. It's not difficult. You simply have to have the political will to do it. And you need to reduce also diversions, working with developers. We have a policy now. I also sit on planning and transportation, but we've now instituted a policy in the city so that when developers build large new buildings and bring in another 3,500 people, in the old days, they'd have occupied the ground floor. We say, no, thank you. That'll be public space from now on. You'll have to go up. But if you're going to disperse vast numbers of people onto our streets, we're going to reclaim those streets. And we are now doing that in large numbers. We're also encouraging people to walk with signed walkways so that they know where they're going, so they can find their way from A to B. We're encouraging as employers, I want to meet with employers, I do meet with employers, to plan routes for their employees individually, so how they get from Liverpool Street to the Strand and the like. And that's something that's very important. It means inevitably that there will be a substantial reduction in motorised transport. And all I can say is it's long overdue. The number of vehicles in our city, in the City of London, has halved in the last 20 years. But that's not enough. We're going to do more. We're going to push to reduce it again by another 25% by 2030 and at least 50% by 2040. There are lots of ways of doing it, but they're very smart ways now. You can do it without infrastructure and clunky expenditure, which becomes out of date very quickly. One of the things I would caution all other boroughs looking at types of this change is this: beware big infrastructure projects. They look great in the glosses from the developers. They look fine for a year or two when you build them. But actually, in a very fast-moving world, they're out of date before you can blink. 4 or 5 years later, I'm going to say this even with Will Norman here, to me, the cycle superhighway looks to me now inflexible, outdated, not something that would be built today. I think it's just, it's a very good thing to have. It's a very good thing to have as a cycleway, don't get me wrong. But it has also created a lot of difficulty for us in the city at junctions such as Blackfriars and Ludgate Circus. Over 38,000 people cross on foot that junction every day. They are by far the more numerous of all the people who use that junction. And yet they have to compete not only with cars, but also cyclists. We're not yet good enough, in my view, at melding the two together. And where we are making cycleways, we want to make them where all people can cycle, young and old alike, not just couriers with head down on fast bikes, as we see, I fear, rather too often. We have made major changes which are controversial. The only last point that I want to make is this. They will be controversial. Whatever you try to do will be controversial. There will be a large body of people who will oppose it. There will be single interest groups who will fight it tooth and nail. Bank Junction is my favourite example. We were told endlessly when we consulted that we couldn't possibly do it. It was inconceivable, it would destroy this and destroy that. Actually, it's transformed the place, in my view, completely. You can now walk in a quiet, cleaner, more safe, more agreeable environment. And you know, when you talk to businesses from the Bank of England downwards, do you know what they now say? It infuriates me sometimes, the way they change their minds. They say, oh, I wish you'd done this much earlier. And my response is, we would have done if you hadn't opposed us for 3 years. Finsbury Circus is another one I want to talk about, because it's an open space. And I want to touch on the question of development such as HS2 and Crossrail. There are great difficulties when there are competing interests with big developments underground and the trains and the like. But we are determined to reopen Finsbury Circus as soon as possible. Open spaces linked with quiet streets is a very important proposal. And next week, in a few days' time, my committee will consider a proposal to implement the very first zero-emission street on Beach Street, which runs parallel to Barbican Estate, not far from where we sit today. The proposal, which will be before the committee, will be to implement an experimental traffic order. We will, of course, consult and look and see how it works. But the idea is that whilst residents will be able to get in and out, and all on smart cameras and no infrastructure, there are 9,500 vehicles using it as a rat run every day. That will stop. One other topic that I wanted to touch on, which we found very successful in the City of London, is to find words and ways of closing streets from time to time, at suitable times, at flexible times. Lunchtime closures is a very good idea because they're much supported by the local businesses, by local people. We do it in Chancery Lane, we're doing it in other areas in the city. Very little opposition, interestingly enough, very successful. I think we should do much more. I want to do it around schools. I'm going to call them school streets, play streets. Close them off at rush times, difficult times. Open them as and when necessary. I very much favour car-free days, as we had in September. I think it's a great initiative by TfL. I want to see more of it. We want to do more in the city, but we can't do it just on our own. It's not that effective. I think we need to do it in central London. And I have a vision. You talked about walkways earlier. I have one big vision I want to leave with you, which is that you ought to be able to walk all the way from the far extremities of Hyde Park, across Constitution Hill, through to Trafalgar Square, down the Strand, across Aldwych, through Fleet Street, down the hill to the most beautiful building in London on the far side of Ludgate Circus at St Paul's, and on through to Aldgate Circus and beyond. That whole walkway ought to be something that we should encourage, sign, give directions, and give pedestrians priority. It's a pan-London walkway. And I would also consider, I was looking at Tower Bridge the other day, I'd like to close Tower Bridge on occasions to traffic, so that it became as it used to become in the old days. It's an incredible building. If you haven't been, let me tell you, go underneath into the bascule, as it's called. It's the most remarkable place. So those are just a few ideas from somebody who is not, I'm afraid, an expert, but I am very passionate about it, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you. The prize, in my judgment, for London is huge. From a dull grey city in the 60s through to the motorised chaos of the 70s and 80s, we are beginning to see now revealed London in all its architectural beauty without pollution and noise. Quieter, cleaner, safer. Oh, and by the way, the conundrum. Who knows the answer to the conundrum?
They're all walkers.
Yes, but that's the easy bit.
One walked by night.
Yes. They walked day and night, every day. Charles Dickens got all his great inspiration from walking from London to Rochester and other places in the middle of the night. We'd like to do the same. Thank you very much.